The glass shattered before Daniela Cruz even understood what had happened. One moment she was setting down a tray of water glasses, and the next, cold liquid was soaking through her white shirt, dripping onto the polished marble floor of the Delmont Grand restaurant. The room went quiet. Every fork stopped moving. Every head turned. Isabella Vance stood with her hand still raised, her diamond bracelet catching the light from the chandelier above. Her face was twisted into a look of disgust, as if she had touched something dirty instead of a glass of water that Daniela had simply placed too close to her elbow. "Are you blind, or just stupid?" Isabella said, loud enough for the entire dining room to hear. "I told you no ice, no ice. Is that so hard to understand? Or maybe you can't read the order at all. I heard girls like you barely finish school." Daniela felt her face burn. She opened her mouth to apologize, but Isabella was already turning to her table, laughing lightly to the two friends seated across from her, as if the whole thing was a joke worth sharing. "Honestly," Isabella continued, waving a manicured hand toward Daniela without even looking at her, "it's hard to find good help these days. Some of them can barely spell their own names, let alone read a menu." The words landed like small stones, sharp and deliberate. A few nearby diners exchanged uncomfortable glances. One woman looked down at her plate, pretending not to hear. A man in a gray suit shifted in his seat, clearly wishing he was somewhere else. Daniela stood frozen, a damp cloth in her hand, water still dripping from the edge of the table. She was 24 years old, and she had worked at the Delmont Grand for almost 2 years. She was putting herself through night classes at the community college, studying accounting, 3 evenings a week after her shifts ended. She had a stack of textbooks at home, with pages worn soft from studying under a single lamp until midnight. She was not stupid, she was not illiterate. But standing there, dripping and humiliated in front of a room full of strangers, she felt smaller than she had ever felt in her life. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," Daniela said quietly, her voice steady despite the shame burning through her chest. "I'll bring a fresh glass right away." Isabella didn't even respond. She simply turned back to her friends, already discussing something else, as if Daniela had already vanished from the room. It was only then that Daniela noticed the man seated across from Isabella. He hadn't said a single word during the entire scene. He hadn't laughed with Isabella's friends. He hadn't looked away in discomfort like the other diners. Instead, his dark eyes were fixed directly on Daniela, calm and unreadable, studying her the way someone studies a puzzle they haven't yet solved. His name was Victor Reyes, though Daniela didn't know that yet. She only knew him as the quiet man who always sat with perfect posture, who tipped generously, and who never raised his voice, not even once, in all the times he had eaten at the restaurant. The other waitstaff whispered about him sometimes. They said he owned half the buildings on the east side of the city. They said men in dark suits waited for him outside in cars that never seemed to move, no matter how long he stayed. They said it was better not to ask questions about a man like that. Daniela had never been afraid of him. If anything, he was the easiest customer she had. He ordered the same black coffee every time, said thank you when she refilled his water, and never once made her feel like she was invisible. Tonight, though, something in his gaze felt different. It wasn't the polite indifference she was used to. It was attention, focused, quiet attention. She turned quickly, gathering the broken glass with trembling hands, eager to escape into the kitchen, where she could breathe without 100 eyes on her. "Daniela." A soft voice stopped her before she reached the swinging door. It was Grace Bennett, a fellow waitress, and the closest thing Daniela had to a friend at the restaurant. Grace pulled her gently into the small hallway behind the kitchen, out of sight of the dining room. "Are you okay?" "That woman is unbelievable. I wanted to throw a drink on her myself." "I'm fine," Daniela said, though her voice wavered. "It's not the first time someone said something like that to me. It won't be the last." "It's not right," Grace said, crossing her arms. "You're smarter than half the people who walk through that door. You're literally studying accounting. Meanwhile, she probably hasn't worked a single day in her life." "People like her don't need to work," Daniela said, wiping the last of the water from her sleeve. "They just need to look good standing next to someone important." Grace shook her head, glancing toward the dining room through the small round window in the swinging door. "That man she's with, the quiet one. Do you know who he is?" "Just a regular," Daniela said. Comes in a few times a month, always polite. That's Victor Reyes, Grace said, lowering her voice as though the name itself carried weight. My cousin works security at one of his buildings downtown. She says people don't cross him, not because he's loud about it. Because he's the opposite. He never has to raise his voice for people to listen. Daniela glanced through the small window herself, catching a glimpse of Victor sitting perfectly still while Isabella spoke animatedly beside him. He didn't say a word the whole time, she said. Didn't laugh either. Maybe he's not as bad as the company he keeps, Grace said with a small shrug. Anyway, forget them. You have 3 more tables and then you're done for the night. Just breathe. Daniela managed a small, tired smile. Doesn't matter what's true. Only matters what people believe when they look at me. She dabbed at her damp shirt with a paper towel, trying to compose herself before returning to the floor. She thought about her younger brother, Leo, 16 years old and full of dreams about becoming an engineer one day. She thought about the tuition payments stacking up, the rent that was due at the end of the month, and the quiet promise she had made to herself the day their mother passed away 3 years earlier, that she would give Leo the kind of future their family never had, whatever it took, whatever people said about her along the way. She took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked back out onto the floor with a fresh glass of water, no ice, exactly as requested. Isabella barely glanced at her as she set it down. Finally, she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for Daniela to hear. Victor's eyes followed Daniela the entire time, though his expression gave nothing away. When she reached his side of the table to refill his coffee, he spoke for the first time since the incident. Thank you, he said simply, his voice low and even. It wasn't much, 2 words. But after the humiliation of the last 10 minutes, those 2 words felt like the only kind thing anyone had said to her all night. Daniela nodded and moved on to the next table, unaware that Victor's gaze lingered on her long after she had walked away. Isabella noticed his silence and frowned. You're quiet tonight, she said, reaching for her wine glass. Something on your mind? Just thinking about business, Victor replied smoothly, though the truth was far more complicated. He was thinking about the way Daniela had apologized for something that wasn't her fault. He was thinking about the calm dignity in her voice, when she could have easily broken down or snapped back. He had spent years surrounded by people who lied, who flattered him to his face, and plotted behind his back, who bent themselves into whatever shape they thought would please him most. Isabella was no different, though she hid it well behind expensive dresses and a practiced smile. Their engagement had been arranged 8 months earlier, a business decision more than anything else, meant to combine his organization's influence with the financial resources of her father's shipping empire. He had accepted it because it made sense on paper. He had never once looked at her the way he had just looked at a waitress in a water-stained shirt. The rest of the dinner passed quickly. Isabella talked about wedding venues, about a designer gown she wanted flown in from overseas, about the guest list that needed to be finalized before the end of the month. Victor nodded along, giving short answers, his mind elsewhere. I was thinking the ceremony should be at the coastal estate, Isabella said, swirling the wine in her glass. My father already spoke to the planner. 600 guests, at least. It needs to make a statement. People should be talking about it for years. Whatever you think is best, Victor said, his tone even, though his attention drifted again toward the far side of the room where Daniela was clearing a table, her movements quick and practiced, despite everything that had just happened to her. You always say that, Isabella said, a hint of irritation slipping into her voice. Whatever I think is best. Don't you have an opinion of your own? I have opinions, Victor said, turning back to her. I simply choose which ones are worth spending on. Isabella studied him for a moment, unsure whether to be flattered or offended, before deciding to let it go. She reached for her phone instead, scrolling through photos of flower arrangements, holding up her screen for him to see, without really waiting for a response. Victor gave a polite nod at each one, though his mind kept circling back to the sound of Daniela's voice apologizing for something that had never been her fault. He had built an empire on reading people quickly, on knowing within seconds whether someone was lying, scheming, or telling the truth. Everything about Daniela's reaction had been genuine. No performance, no manipulation, just quiet dignity in the face of cruelty. It was a rare thing in his world, rarer than he liked to admit. When the bill came, he paid it without looking at the total, as he always did. But before he left, he asked to speak with the restaurant manager, a nervous man named Mr. Harlow, who came hurrying over the moment he heard Victor Reyes wanted a word. "Is everything all right, sir?" Mr. Harlow asked, wringing his hands slightly. "Everything is fine," Victor said calmly. "I have a question. The young woman who was serving our table tonight, what is her name?" Mr. Harlow blinked, clearly confused by the request but far too intimidated to ask why. "That would be Daniela, sir. Daniela Cruz. She's one of our best servers, very reliable." Victor nodded slowly, filing the name away. "Thank you," he said, and then he stood, buttoning his jacket, offering his arm to Isabella as they walked toward the exit. Isabella glanced back once toward the dining room, her eyes briefly finding Daniela across the room. There was no apology in her expression, only a flicker of satisfaction, as though the entire evening had gone exactly as she intended. Daniela watched them leave through the front windows, the sleek black car pulling away into the night. She let out a long breath, the tension in her shoulders finally easing now that the dangerous part of the evening was over. "You survived," Grace said, appearing beside her with a stack of clean plates. "Barely, but you survived." "I always do," Daniela said quietly. She finished her shift 2 hours later, exhausted in the particular way that came from holding herself together in front of strangers who wanted to see her break. She walked to the bus stop alone, the night air cool against her skin, her mind replaying Isabella's words, even though she wished it wouldn't. Illiterate, stupid. The words followed her home like unwanted company, no matter how many times she reminded herself they weren't true. At home, she found Leo at the kitchen table, textbooks spread out in front of him, a plate of reheated rice waiting for her under a napkin. "Rough night?" he asked, noticing the tired lines around her eyes. "Just a long one," she said, forcing a smile as she sat down beside him. "How was your exam?" "I think I did okay," he said. "Maybe even good." "You did great," she said, ruffling his hair the way she had since they were children. "I know it." Later that night, after Leo had gone to bed, Daniela sat at the same table with her own textbooks open, the numbers blurring slightly from exhaustion. She thought about the calm man who had thanked her, the one who hadn't laughed along with the cruelty at the table. She wondered briefly who he was, then pushed the thought away. Men like that didn't think twice about waitresses once they walked out the door. She had learned a long time ago not to expect kindness to follow her home. She had no way of knowing that across the city, in a quiet office on the top floor of a building he owned, Victor Reyes was sitting behind his desk, a single sheet of paper in front of him, with one name written across it. Daniela Cruz. He stared at it for a long time before finally picking up his phone. "I need everything you can find," he said to the voice on the other end, "on a woman named Daniela Cruz, quietly. No one is to know I asked." The voice on the other end, a man named Marcus, who had worked for Victor for nearly a decade, hesitated only briefly before responding. "Understood. May I ask why?" Victor looked out his window at the city lights stretching endlessly below him, thinking of the steady, quiet dignity in a young woman's voice, as she apologized for something that was never her fault. "Because," he said slowly, "I think I just met someone who has never once lied to me. And I want to know who she really is." He ended the call and sat in silence for a long while, the city humming below him, unaware that the decision he had just made would soon change everything, for himself, for Isabella, and most of all, for a tired waitress who only wanted to make it through another shift without being made to feel small. Marcus called back within the hour, his voice quick and efficient over the phone. "I have some early details," he said. "Daniela Cruz, 24 years old, works at the Delmont Grand 5 nights a week, also enrolled part-time at the city college, studying accounting. No family money. Father passed when she was a child. Mother passed 3 years ago. She has a younger brother, 16, currently in high school. She's been paying his tuition and their rent on her own since their mother died." Victor listened without interrupting, turning the information over slowly in his mind. It matched everything he had already sensed about her, the quiet strength beneath the exhaustion, the discipline it must have taken to work full nights and still show up to class with a clear head. Anything unusual? Victor asked. Debts? Associations? Anything that concerns me? Nothing, Marcus said. She's clean. Almost boringly clean, if I'm honest. Pays her bills on time. No late payments. No complaints from previous employers. If anything, her file reads like someone who has spent her whole life trying not to be noticed. Victor almost smiled at that. In his world, everyone wanted to be noticed, wanted power, wanted influence, wanted to be seen standing next to someone important. Daniela Cruz seemed to want none of it. She simply wanted to survive, to protect her brother, to build a future with her own two hands, without asking anyone for help along the way. Keep it quiet, Victor said finally. I don't want her to know we're looking into her. Not yet. Understood, Marcus said. Can I ask what this is about, Victor? You've never asked me to look into a waitress before. Victor was silent for a long moment, watching the lights of the city flicker below him like scattered stars that had fallen and refused to go out. I watched a woman get humiliated tonight in front of a room full of strangers, he said finally, and she never once raised her voice. Never once said something she would regret. I don't know many people like that, Marcus. Not in my world, not in hers. And Isabella? Marcus asked carefully. Does she know you're asking questions about someone else? No, Victor said. And she won't, until I decide what any of this means. He hung up the phone and sat alone in the quiet of his office long after the call ended, staring at the folder Marcus would soon send over, a folder that held the entire life of a woman who had no idea she had just caught the attention of one of the most powerful men in the city. Somewhere across town, Daniela was closing her textbook for the night, unaware that her ordinary, difficult, determined life had just become the center of someone else's very careful attention. Tomorrow would begin like any other day. She had no way of knowing it would be the last ordinary day she would ever have. Daniela's hands froze mid-motion, a stack of plates balanced against her hip, when she saw him walk through the door alone. No Isabella. No friends trailing behind him with their expensive laughter. Just Victor Reyes, dressed simply in a dark coat, choosing a small table near the window instead of the private booth he usually shared with his fiancée. It was barely past noon, hours before the dinner rush, and the restaurant was nearly empty. Daniela glanced toward Mr. Harlow, who straightened his tie immediately and hurried over to greet their most important customer personally, but Victor simply raised a hand, polite but firm. I'd like Daniela to serve me today, if that's all right, he said. Mr. Harlow blinked, clearly startled, but nodded quickly. Of course, sir. Whatever you prefer. Daniela approached the table with careful steps, her mind racing. Had she done something wrong the other night? Was he here to complain? To have her fired? To finish what Isabella had started? She forced her expression into calm professionalism, the same mask she wore through every difficult shift. Good afternoon, she said. Can I start you with your usual coffee? Please, Victor said. He studied her for a moment before continuing. I wanted to apologize for the other evening. What happened at that table was unacceptable, and I said nothing. That was a mistake on my part. Daniela's guard slipped slightly, surprise flickering across her face. You don't need to apologize for someone else's words, sir. Perhaps not, Victor said. But silence is its own kind of agreement, and I don't like what my silence agreed to that night. Daniela didn't quite know how to respond to that. In 2 years of serving hundreds of customers, she had never once heard anyone speak to her this way, as though her feelings actually mattered, as though an apology owed to her was worth giving, even when it cost the giver nothing but pride. I'll get your coffee, she said finally, retreating toward the kitchen before he could see how much his words had affected her. When she returned, Victor asked simple questions, nothing that felt intrusive, just enough to keep a quiet conversation flowing between refills. He asked how long she had worked at the restaurant. He asked, carefully, what she studied at night, as though he didn't already know the answer from the folder sitting on his desk. Accounting, Daniela said, setting down his coffee cup. I want to work with numbers. Something stable. Something that lets me build a real life for my brother and me. That's a good reason, Victor said. Better than most reasons people have for what they choose to do with their lives. What reason did you have? Daniela asked, immediately regretting the question. It felt too personal, too forward for a conversation between a waitress and a customer. But Victor didn't seem offended. He considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. "I didn't choose my life," he said finally. "It chose me a long time ago. I've spent most of my years since then, trying to make something useful out of it." Daniela wanted to ask what he meant, but a group of businessmen walked through the door just then, requiring her attention. She excused herself, and when she returned 20 minutes later, Victor had already gone, leaving behind an unusually generous tip and a folded napkin with a short note written in neat handwriting. "Thank you for your honesty. Very few people offer it freely." Daniela stared at the note for a long moment, before slipping it into her apron pocket, unsure why it felt important enough to keep. Over the following 2 weeks, Victor returned several more times, always alone, always requesting her table, always leaving before the evening crowd arrived. Their conversations grew slightly longer each time, though they remained careful, respectful, never crossing into territory that felt improper. He learned she had grown up 2 neighborhoods over from the restaurant, that she used to help her mother sew alterations for extra income before her mother's health declined, that she had taught herself to budget every dollar so precisely that she hadn't missed a single tuition payment in 18 months. Daniela learned very little about him in return, only that he preferred silence to small talk, that he read constantly, always carrying a worn paperback in his coat pocket, and that despite the whispers about who he really was, he had never once been anything but respectful toward her. Grace noticed the pattern before Daniela was willing to admit it to herself. "He asked for your table again," Grace said one afternoon, leaning against the kitchen counter while Daniela loaded a tray with fresh napkins. "3rd time this week. You know that's not normal, right? Men like him don't come back for the coffee." "It's not like that," Daniela said, though her cheeks warmed slightly. "He's polite, that's all. He apologized for what happened with his fiancée. That's the only reason any of this started." "An apology doesn't need 3 visits," Grace said, raising an eyebrow. "Just be careful, Daniela. Whatever world he comes from, it's not the kind of world people like us just casually step into and step back out of again." Daniela knew Grace meant well, and part of her recognized the truth in the warning. She had heard enough whispers about Victor Reyes to understand that his politeness toward her didn't erase whatever else his life involved, the things people spoke about, only in careful, lowered voices. But every time he sat across from her, calm and thoughtful, asking real questions and actually listening to her answers, it became harder to reconcile the rumors with the man in front of her. "I'm not stepping into anything," Daniela said, though even to her own ears, the words sounded less certain than she intended. "He's a customer. Nothing more." Grace said nothing further, but the look on her face suggested she wasn't entirely convinced, and neither, if Daniela was honest with herself, was she. What Daniela didn't know was that behind the scenes, Victor had quietly arranged for small, meaningful changes in her life without ever taking credit for them. Her shift schedule shifted slightly to align better with her night classes, something Mr. Harlow explained as a scheduling adjustment for staffing efficiency, never mentioning the phone call he had received suggesting it. A scholarship opportunity at her college mysteriously appeared, one that covered the remainder of her tuition, administered through a foundation she had never heard of, with no explanation of how her name had come to their attention. She assumed it was luck, the kind of rare good fortune that occasionally interrupted a life defined by hard work and little else. She thanked whatever force had granted it, and continued studying harder than ever, determined to prove herself worthy of the opportunity. Victor watched these small changes unfold from a distance, satisfied not by gratitude he would never receive, but by the simple fact that her burden had lightened, even slightly, without her ever needing to know his name was attached to it. At home, Daniela shared the news of her scholarship with Leo, both of them sitting at the kitchen table long past midnight, disbelief and relief mixing together as she read the letter aloud for the 3rd time. "This doesn't make sense," Leo said, reading over her shoulder. "You didn't even apply for this. How does a scholarship just find you?" "I don't know," Daniela admitted, folding the letter carefully, as though it might disappear if handled too roughly. "Maybe one of my professors recommended me. Maybe it's just luck, finally, after everything." Or maybe the universe finally noticed you deserve something good, Leo said, grinning as he nudged her shoulder. Daniela laughed, a rare, full laugh that eased some of the exhaustion carved into her face. Maybe, she said softly. I'll take it, whatever the reason. She had no way of connecting the sudden opportunity to the quiet man who sat at her table twice a week, asking careful questions and listening as though her answers actually mattered. If she had known, she wasn't certain how she would have felt, grateful or unsettled, touched or wary of a kindness that came with strings she couldn't yet see. Isabella, meanwhile, grew increasingly suspicious of her fiancé's distraction. He answered her calls less promptly. He seemed distant during their dinners together, his attention drifting even when she spoke directly to him. She assumed, at first, that it was business pressure, the kind of stress that came naturally to a man in his position. But as the weeks passed, her suspicion sharpened into something more deliberate. "You've been strange lately," Isabella said one evening, seated across from him in his penthouse, a glass of wine untouched in front of her, distracted, distant. "Is something wrong with the wedding plans?" "The wedding plans are fine," Victor said, not looking up from the documents spread across his desk. "Then what is it?" Isabella pressed, her voice sharpening at the edges. "You used to at least pretend to be interested in what I had to say." Victor finally looked up, studying her with the same careful attention he gave everything, weighing his words before speaking them. "Our engagement was never about interest, Isabella. We both know that. It was arranged to benefit both our families. I've honored that arrangement. I don't recall promising anything beyond it." Isabella's expression flickered, something sharp and cold passing behind her eyes, before she smoothed it into practiced composure. "Careful," she said quietly. "My father has invested a great deal into this partnership. Don't forget what's at stake if it falls apart." "I haven't forgotten," Victor said evenly. "Have you?" The question hung in the air, heavier than either of them acknowledged aloud. Isabella gathered her things shortly after, offering a tight goodbye before leaving his penthouse, her heels echoing sharply against the marble floor. Alone again, Victor allowed himself a rare moment of honesty with his own thoughts. He had entered this engagement with clear eyes, understanding exactly what it was and what it wasn't. He had never expected passion, never expected warmth, only the practical benefits of aligned business interests. But lately, that practical arrangement felt increasingly hollow, especially when compared to something as simple and unexpected as a conversation over black coffee with a woman who owed him nothing and asked for even less. He thought of Daniela's laugh, quiet and rare, the way it had surprised even her when he made an offhand comment about the terrible coffee at a diner near his old neighborhood. He thought of the calm strength in her voice, the same strength she had shown the night Isabella humiliated her, never breaking, never losing herself to anger or despair. He knew what he was doing was dangerous, both for her and for himself. In his world, weakness was a door left open for enemies to walk through, and attachment, real attachment, was often the sharpest weakness of all. Isabella's family had considerable influence, connections that stretched into corners of the business world Victor still needed for now. Ending the engagement recklessly could unravel delicate agreements years in the making. But he also knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he could not continue pretending the arrangement with Isabella was something he was willing to protect forever, not when it required him to look away from someone as genuine as Daniela Cruz. Later that week, Marcus arrived at his office with a folder considerably thicker than the one he had delivered weeks earlier, his expression unusually serious. "You wanted updates on Isabella's family accounts," Marcus said, setting the folder down carefully. "I found something. It's not good." Victor opened the folder slowly, his eyes scanning the documents inside, financial records, transfer histories, signatures that didn't quite match the explanations attached to them. His expression remained calm, but something in his eyes sharpened, cold and focused. "How long has this been happening?" he asked quietly. "At least 8 months," Marcus said, "since before the engagement was finalized." Victor closed the folder slowly, setting it aside with deliberate care, though his mind was already working through the implications, the timing, the careful positioning that suggested Isabella's family had planned this arrangement far more strategically than he had originally believed. "Keep investigating," Victor said finally, quietly, I want to know everything before I decide what to do about it. Marcus nodded, gathering his things to leave, but paused at the door. Victor, he said carefully, if this is what it looks like, ending things with Isabella isn't going to be simple. Her father isn't the kind of man who accepts embarrassment quietly. I'm aware, Victor said, his voice calm despite the weight of what lay ahead. But some things need to end, regardless of how difficult the ending might be. He looked out toward the city window once more, thinking not of Isabella, not even of the financial betrayal now unfolding in front of him, but of a quiet waitress across town, who had no idea how deeply her honesty had already begun to reshape the careful, guarded world of a man who had long since stopped expecting anyone to be exactly who they appeared to be. For the first time in years, Victor felt something close to certainty about a decision that had nothing to do with business, and everything to do with the kind of life he actually wanted to build, whether or not it was the life anyone expected of him. The following afternoon, Victor returned to the Delmont Grand, arriving earlier than usual, before the lunch crowd had even settled in. Daniela was refilling condiment trays near the front window when she saw him enter, and something in his expression told her this visit was different from the others. He seemed more guarded, his eyes carrying a weight she hadn't noticed before. You look like you have something on your mind, she said, setting his coffee down without being asked. I do, Victor admitted, surprising her with his honesty. Complicated things, things I can't discuss easily. You don't have to, Daniela said gently. I'm not asking you to. I know, Victor said. That's part of why I keep coming back. Daniela sat down briefly across from him, something she had never allowed herself to do with a customer before, breaking a rule she had followed strictly for 2 years. Can I ask you something honestly? She said. Why does it matter to you what I think, or what I ask, or don't ask? You have an entire life I know nothing about. I'm just a waitress who spilled water on your fiancé's table. Victor considered the question carefully, the way he considered everything, before answering. Because in my world, everyone wants something from me, he said. Money, protection, influence, position. Even Isabella's affection came wrapped around a business arrangement neither of us ever pretended was anything more. You've never once asked me for anything, Daniela. Not favors, not money, not even simple kindness. You just exist, exactly as you are, without performing for anyone's benefit. That's rarer than you probably realize. Daniela didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded, letting the weight of his words settle between them in comfortable silence. I should get back to work, she said finally, standing and smoothing her apron. But thank you for saying that. Thank you for listening, Victor replied. Not everyone does, even when they pretend to. As she walked away, Victor watched her go, more certain than ever that whatever complicated, dangerous path lay ahead of him, walking away from Isabella and the arrangement built on lies and quiet financial betrayal, it would be worth it if it meant more honest afternoons like this one, however few and far between they might turn out to be. The phone in Isabella's hand trembled slightly as she stared at the message on her screen, her manicured nails digging into the leather case. Her private accountant, a man she trusted completely, was warning her that someone had been quietly requesting access to old transfer records tied to her father's shipping accounts. Someone with serious resources, someone who knew exactly where to look. She didn't need to guess who it was. Across the city, Victor sat in his office, reviewing the final pieces of Marcus's investigation, each document confirming what he had already suspected. Isabella's family had used the engagement not merely as a business alliance, but as a calculated opportunity to gain insider access to his organization's financial infrastructure, siphoning small, carefully hidden amounts through accounts that appeared, on the surface, to be entirely legitimate. It's clever, Marcus admitted, standing across from Victor's desk. Small enough not to trigger alarms individually, but consistent, almost 9 months of steady transfers. If we hadn't started looking specifically at her father's accounts, we might never have caught it. 9 months, Victor repeated quietly, which means it started before the engagement was even finalized. They planned this from the beginning, Marcus confirmed. The wedding was never about business alliance for them. It was about access. Victor closed the folder, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign of the anger simmering beneath his controlled exterior. He had built his organization on careful trust, on relationships tested and proven over years, and Isabella's family had exploited that trust with calm, deliberate precision, hiding behind champagne toasts and wedding planning, as though nothing beneath the surface had ever been anything but genuine. "I want everything documented," Victor said. "Every transfer, every signature, every account. When I confront them, I want it to be undeniable." "And Isabella herself?" Marcus asked carefully. "Do you think she knows the full extent of it, or is she simply following her father's instructions?" Victor considered the question, thinking back over months of careful observation, the way Isabella's charm always seemed to sharpen whenever business connections were mentioned, the way she asked pointed questions about his organization's structure that seemed innocent at the time, but now revealed themselves as something far more calculated. "She knows," Victor said finally. "She's not a bystander in this. She's been playing her part just as deliberately as her father has been playing his." Isabella's father, Gerald Vance, was not a man accustomed to being questioned. He had built his shipping empire from a single cargo vessel into a fleet that controlled nearly a third of the ports along the eastern coastline, and he had done so by making sure no one, not business partners, not rivals, not even his own daughter, ever saw the full picture of how his empire truly operated. When Isabella called him that evening, her voice tight with barely restrained panic, he listened in silence for a long moment before responding. "He knows," Isabella said, "or close enough to it. He as good as told me himself." "Then we accelerate the timeline," Gerald said calmly, as though discussing nothing more serious than a shipping delay. "The wedding moves forward within the month. Once the merger is finalized, and the accounts are fully integrated, it won't matter what he suspects. It will be too late to unwind." "And if he refuses to move forward with the wedding at all?" Isabella asked. "He's already distant, father. Distracted. I don't think he wants this anymore." "He wants his organization's reputation intact," Gerald said. "A broken engagement of this size, especially so close to the wedding, would raise exactly the kind of questions he can't afford publicly. Men like Victor Reyes protect appearances above almost everything else. Use that. Remind him what's at stake if this falls apart messily." Isabella hung up the phone, feeling no more reassured than before the call, an uneasy awareness settling in her chest that the plan her father had built so carefully was beginning to show cracks neither of them had anticipated. Meanwhile, Daniela's life continued along its steady, determined path, unaware of the storm quietly building around the man who had become an unexpected fixture in her weeks. Her classes grew more demanding as final exams approached, and she found herself staying later at the library after her shifts, pushing through exhaustion with the same discipline that had carried her through every difficult year since her mother passed away. One evening, walking home later than usual after a study session that stretched well past closing hours, Daniela became aware of a car slowing beside her on the quiet street. Her heart quickened, old instincts from growing up in a rougher part of the city rising instantly to the surface. But when the window rolled down, it was Victor's calm face that appeared, not a stranger's. "It's late for you to be walking alone," he said simply. "I do it all the time," Daniela replied, though she slowed her steps, some tension in her shoulders easing at the familiar sight of him. "I'm used to it." "Being used to something doesn't make it safe," Victor said. "Let me drive you home." Daniela hesitated, glancing around the empty street, weighing the strangeness of the moment against the practical relief of not walking another 15 minutes in the cold. "Just this once," she said finally, climbing into the passenger seat. The drive was quiet at first, comfortable in a way that surprised her. Victor didn't fill the silence with unnecessary conversation, and Daniela found herself relaxing into the warmth of the car, her tired mind finally allowed a moment of stillness. "You look exhausted," Victor said eventually, glancing at her briefly, before returning his eyes to the road. "Finals are coming up," Daniela admitted. "I'm trying to keep my grades high enough to keep the scholarship. It's a lot, on top of work." "You'll manage it," Victor said, a quiet confidence in his voice that felt different from empty encouragement. "I've never seen you fail to manage anything you set your mind to." Daniela glanced at him, surprised by the certainty in his tone. "You barely know me," she said softly. "I know enough," Victor replied. They arrived at her apartment building a few minutes later, and Victor walked around to open her door before she could reach for the handle herself, a small gesture that struck her as oddly formal for a man whose reputation suggested nothing but ruthless efficiency in every other part of his life. "Thank you," Daniela said, standing on the sidewalk, unsure how to end the moment properly. "For the ride, and for checking on me." "Of course," Victor said. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "Daniela, I need to tell you something, and I understand if it complicates things between us." Her stomach tightened slightly at the seriousness in his voice. "What is it?" "My engagement to Isabella is ending," Victor said plainly. "It should have ended already. There are complicated reasons why it hasn't. Business reasons I won't burden you with. But I wanted you to hear it from me directly rather than through rumors or headlines, if it comes to that." Daniela stood quietly for a moment, processing the weight of what he had just told her. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked carefully. "I'm not part of your world, Victor. Whatever happens with your engagement, it has nothing to do with me." "I think you already know that's not entirely true," Victor said, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability behind the words. "I'm not asking anything of you. I only wanted to be honest, because you've been honest with me every single time we've spoken, and I didn't want to keep something this significant hidden." Daniela felt her pulse quicken, a mixture of confusion and something else she wasn't ready to name settling in her chest. "I appreciate you telling me," she said finally. "But I have enough complicated things in my own life right now. I can't add whatever this is to the list." "I understand," Victor said, though something in his expression suggested the answer cost him more than he let show. "Take care of yourself, Daniela. I mean that." He waited until she was safely inside the building before driving away, leaving Daniela standing in the small hallway of her apartment building, her heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Upstairs, Leo was already asleep, his textbooks scattered across the kitchen table, where he had fallen asleep studying. Daniela sat down quietly across from him, staring at nothing in particular, replaying the conversation over and over in her mind. She thought of Isabella's cruel words weeks earlier, of the calm, steady presence Victor had become in her life since then, of the impossible gap between his world and hers that no amount of kindness could fully close. She didn't sleep well that night, her mind caught between practical caution and a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in a very long time, something dangerously close to hope. The next morning, Grace noticed the change in her friend immediately, the distracted look in her eyes as she rolled silverware into napkins, without really seeing what her hands were doing. "You're somewhere else today," Grace said, nudging her gently. "What happened?" Daniela hesitated, unsure how much to share. "He told me his engagement is ending," she said finally, keeping her voice low, despite the empty dining room around them. "And then he told me why he wanted me to know." Grace's eyebrows rose slowly. "And what did you say?" "I told him I couldn't add anything else complicated to my life right now," Daniela admitted. "Which is true. Finals are in 2 weeks. I have Leo to think about. I can't afford to get distracted by something that could fall apart the moment his world finds out he's spending time with someone like me." "Someone like you," Grace repeated, shaking her head. "Daniela, you're one of the most capable people I know. Whatever gap you think exists between his world and yours, it's not because you're not enough. It's because his world is complicated and dangerous, and you'd be smart to be cautious. But don't confuse caution with thinking you're somehow less than him. You're not." Daniela managed a small, grateful smile. "I know," she said quietly. "It's just easier to focus on numbers and exams than figure out what any of this means." "Fair enough," Grace said, squeezing her shoulder briefly before returning to her own tables. "Just don't let fear make the decision for you either. There's a difference between being careful and closing a door before you even know what's on the other side of it." Daniela thought about those words for the rest of her shift, turning them over as she moved between tables, unable to fully shake the memory of Victor's steady voice, telling her he wanted her to hear the truth directly from him, rather than through rumors that might reach her another way. The following week, Isabella arrived unannounced at Victor's penthouse, her composed exterior cracking slightly as she confronted him directly. "I know someone has been investigating my father's accounts," she said, her voice sharp with barely controlled anger. "I know it's you. What exactly are you trying to prove?" Victor remained calm, watching her carefully. I'm trying to understand why 9 months of quiet transfers have been moving through accounts connected to your family, routed through structures designed specifically to avoid detection. Isabella's face paled slightly before hardening into practiced defiance. You're imagining things. My father's business dealings are none of your concern. They became my concern, Victor said evenly, the moment they started drawing from my organization's resources under the cover of our engagement. For a moment, Isabella said nothing, her mask slipping just enough to reveal genuine fear beneath the anger. Then, just as quickly, she composed herself again, her voice turning cold and deliberate. Be very careful, Victor. My father has connections you don't fully understand. If you try to embarrass this family publicly, there will be consequences, for you and for anyone you care about. Victor's expression didn't change, though something dangerous settled behind his calm gaze. Is that a threat, Isabella? It's a warning, she said, straightening her shoulders as she moved toward the door. One I'd advise you to take seriously. She left without another word, the door closing sharply behind her, leaving Victor alone with the quiet certainty that whatever came next would not be simple, and that the people he cared about, including a waitress who wanted nothing from him at all, might now find themselves standing far closer to danger than any of them deserved. Victor called Marcus back within minutes of Isabella's departure, his voice controlled but urgent. Increase security around the Delmont Grand, he said, quietly. I don't want it obvious, but I want someone watching the building at all times, especially during Daniela's shifts. You think Isabella would go after her directly? Marcus asked, surprise evident in his tone. I think Isabella's father is the kind of man who uses every available advantage the moment he feels cornered, Victor said. I'm not willing to gamble on him having limits I haven't confirmed. Understood, Marcus said. I'll have someone in place by tonight. Victor ended the call and stood at his window for a long time, watching the city below settle into evening, thinking not of the financial evidence stacking steadily against Isabella's family, nor of the business consequences that would follow once he finally acted on it, but of the quiet strength in Daniela's voice the night before, the careful boundary she had drawn even as her eyes told a different story. He understood her hesitation completely. She had spent her entire life building stability for herself and her brother, brick by careful brick, and he was asking her, without meaning to risk that stability on uncertain ground. He couldn't blame her for choosing caution. If anything, it was further proof of exactly why he respected her as much as he did. But as the details of Isabella's betrayal grew clearer with each passing day, Victor found himself certain of one thing above all else. Whatever storm was coming, whatever consequences followed once he finally confronted Gerald Vance and ended the engagement publicly and permanently, he intended to make certain Daniela Cruz remained safely outside its reach, whether she ever allowed herself to be part of his life or not. Daniela's phone buzzed violently against the counter, just as she stepped into the restaurant for her evening shift. One message after another flooding in from Grace, each one more frantic than the last. Before she could even read them fully, Mr. Harlow appeared at her side, his face pale and serious. Daniela, there's something you need to see, he said, guiding her toward the small office behind the kitchen. Security called. There are police outside, asking about missing funds from the register, and there's a woman here, demanding to speak with you directly. Daniela's stomach dropped. Missing funds? I haven't touched the register in weeks. I don't even have access to it during my usual shifts. I know, Mr. Harlow said quickly. The numbers don't add up on paper, but the timing lines up with your shift specifically. Someone altered the records. I don't understand how, but the accusation is serious, and it's not going away quietly. Before Daniela could process what he was saying, the office door opened, revealing Isabella standing in the doorway, perfectly composed, a cold, satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. There she is, Isabella said smoothly. The woman who thought she could quietly worm her way into places she doesn't belong. What is this? Daniela asked, her voice steadier than she felt, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. I haven't done anything wrong. Really? Isabella said, stepping further into the small office. Because the restaurant's financial records suggest otherwise. Discrepancies traced directly back to your shifts, over several weeks. It's remarkable, honestly, how someone barely capable of finishing a full sentence managed something this complicated. That's not true, Daniela said, anger finally breaking through the fear in her voice. I don't even have register access. Anyone can check that. Records can be adjusted, Isabella said with a shrug, her tone almost bored, especially when someone with real resources decides they need to be. The implication landed clearly, and Daniela felt the floor shift beneath her, understanding all at once that Isabella hadn't simply arrived to gloat. She had arrived because she had orchestrated this entire situation deliberately, manufacturing evidence solid enough to destroy Daniela's reputation, her scholarship, possibly even her freedom, all as a calculated act of retaliation. Why are you doing this? Daniela asked quietly, though she already suspected the answer. Because you didn't know your place, Isabella said, her composed mask slipping just enough to reveal genuine venom beneath it. Victor has been distracted for weeks, distant, uninterested in everything that actually matters, and it started right around the time he began requesting your table specifically. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? Did you think someone like you could simply exist in his orbit without consequences? Before Daniela could respond, the office door opened again, and this time it was Victor who stepped through, his expression carved from something far colder and more dangerous than Daniela had ever seen on his face before. Isabella, he said, his voice deceptively calm. I'd be careful about what you say next. Isabella turned quickly, some of her composure cracking at his sudden appearance. Victor, I didn't realize you would be here. Clearly not, Victor said, stepping fully into the room, his eyes moving briefly to Daniela, before returning to Isabella with unmistakable intensity. I received a call about police outside this restaurant, investigating fabricated theft charges against an employee I have specific reason to trust completely. Would you care to explain how financial records tied to a woman with no register access somehow implicate her in theft that never happened? I don't know what you're talking about, Isabella said, though her voice wavered slightly. I think you do, Victor said. He turned to Mr. Harlow, who stood frozen near the doorway. Pull the full security footage from every shift referenced in those altered records. I want timestamps, register access logs, and personnel files. All of it, immediately. Mr. Harlow nodded quickly, hurrying to comply, grateful for an excuse to leave the tension-filled room. You can't seriously believe her over evidence, Isabella said, though her confidence was clearly faltering under Victor's unwavering attention. I don't need to believe her, Victor said. I need evidence, and evidence has a habit of revealing exactly what actually happened, regardless of what story someone tries to attach to it beforehand. While Mr. Harlow gathered the footage, Grace slipped quietly into the office, her face tight with worry, as she stood beside Daniela, refusing to leave her side, despite the tension thick enough to fill the small room. I saw the police cars outside, Grace whispered. I came as fast as I could. What is happening? She's trying to say I stole money, Daniela whispered back, her voice shaking despite her effort to stay composed. Money I never touched, from a register I don't even have access to. That's insane, Grace said, glancing warily at Isabella, who stood near the window with her arms crossed, watching the room with cold detachment. Everyone who works here knows you'd never do something like that. You barely take an extra roll of silverware without asking permission first. Victor, standing near the door, caught the exchange and allowed himself the faintest flicker of something close to reassurance. Even in this small, frightened room, surrounded by fabricated accusations and quiet threats, Daniela was not alone. She had built genuine relationships through nothing but consistent honesty, the very thing Isabella had never once bothered to cultivate with anyone around her. I want statements from every staff member who worked alongside Daniela during the shifts in question, Victor said, his voice cutting cleanly through the tense silence. Written, signed, timestamped. I want this resolved with more evidence than anyone could ever reasonably dispute. Mr. Harlow nodded quickly, already moving to gather the necessary staff before Victor even finished speaking. Within the hour, the security footage confirmed everything Daniela had said. She had never once accessed the register during any of the shifts in question. The falsified records had been entered remotely, traced back through a series of digital signatures that, once properly examined, led directly to an account connected to Isabella's personal assistant. Standing in the small office with the evidence laid bare in front of them, Isabella's carefully constructed accusation collapsed entirely, leaving her exposed in front of Victor, Mr. Harlow, and the small group of restaurant staff who had gathered nervously near the doorway once word of the confrontation spread. "You tried to destroy an innocent woman's life," Victor said, his voice low and controlled, though the anger beneath it was unmistakable, "because you were threatened by the fact that she never once had to manipulate anyone to earn genuine respect." "You have no idea what you're talking about," Isabella snapped, though her voice cracked slightly, revealing the fear beneath her anger. "I know enough," Victor said. "I know about the transfers your father has been routing through my organization's accounts for the past 9 months. I know this engagement was never about partnership. It was about access, disguised as affection neither of us ever actually felt." The color drained from Isabella's face as the full weight of what Victor knew finally registered. "You can't prove any of that," she said, though the certainty had entirely left her voice. "I can," Victor said calmly, "and I will, publicly, unless you and your father withdraw from every account connected to my organization within the next 48 hours, returning everything taken, plus appropriate compensation for the inconvenience of discovering it." Isabella stood frozen, caught between the shame of exposure and the practical reality that Victor held every card in a game she and her father had badly misjudged. Without another word, she turned and left the office, her heels echoing sharply down the hallway, the same sound that had once carried confidence, now carrying something closer to defeat. Once she was gone, Victor turned to Daniela, his expression softening slightly for the first time since he had entered the room. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," Daniela admitted, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the past hour. "That was terrifying. If you hadn't arrived when you did, you would have handled it," Victor said firmly. "The evidence was already on your side. I simply made sure it was found quickly enough to matter." "Why did you come tonight?" Daniela asked. "You didn't know any of this was happening until you walked through that door." Victor hesitated slightly, something vulnerable crossing his usually composed features. "I've had someone quietly watching over the restaurant during your shifts for the past week," he admitted. "After my last conversation with Isabella, I suspected she might try something. I didn't expect it to happen this quickly, or this cruelly, but I'm grateful I was close enough to intervene." Daniela absorbed this information slowly, understanding fully for the first time the depth of protection Victor had quietly extended toward her without her knowledge. Part of her wanted to feel uneasy about it, about how closely her life had been watched without her awareness, but standing there, still shaken from the accusations Isabella had thrown at her, she found she felt something closer to gratitude than discomfort. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing me, for coming." "You never needed me to believe you," Victor said. "The truth believed you long before I arrived. I only made certain everyone else caught up to it." Mr. Harlow returned moments later, profusely apologetic, assuring Daniela that her position at the restaurant remained completely secure, that the false accusations would be formally cleared from any record, and that appropriate measures would be taken to ensure nothing similar happened again. Daniela accepted his apology graciously, though the events of the evening left her emotionally drained, in a way she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Grace stayed close through it all, bringing her a cup of tea she hadn't asked for, sitting quietly beside her while the last of the staff statements were collected. "You held it together better than I would have," Grace said softly, once the office had finally emptied out. "I would have been in tears the second she walked through that door." "I still might be, later," Daniela admitted, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "Right now I think I'm too tired to feel anything properly." "That's fair," Grace said. "For what it's worth, watching him walk in and take your side without a second of hesitation, that wasn't nothing, Daniela. Whatever you decide to do about him, I don't think that kind of loyalty is easy to find, especially not from someone with as much to lose as he clearly has." Daniela didn't answer right away, staring down at the tea slowly cooling in her hands, thinking of the calm certainty in Victor's voice as he dismantled Isabella's accusation piece by piece, evidence by evidence, without a single moment of doubt on her behalf. It was one thing to be told someone believed in you, it was another thing entirely to watch them prove it, decisively, in front of people who could have easily chosen to look away instead. "I know," she said finally, quietly. "I noticed." As the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm, Victor walked Daniela to the small break room, waiting quietly while she gathered her things, neither of them speaking much, both still absorbing the intensity of what had just unfolded. Marcus had arrived quietly sometime during the confrontation, standing near the entrance of the restaurant, watching the entire scene unfold with careful, practiced attention. Once Isabella had gone, he approached Victor with a brief nod. "That went about as well as it could have, given the circumstances," Marcus said. "Gerald Vance will hear about this within the hour, if he hasn't already." "Let him," Victor said. "The evidence is documented. There's nothing left for him to spin into something other than what it actually is." "And the wedding?" Marcus asked. "Officially, publicly, it's finished?" "Officially, publicly, and permanently," Victor confirmed. "I'll have the formal statement drafted tonight. I want this handled cleanly, without leaving room for Isabella's family to construct a different narrative once the shock wears off." Marcus glanced briefly toward the break room, where Daniela sat gathering her things beside Grace. "And her?" he asked carefully. "Are you certain about involving her further in all of this? Once this becomes public, people will ask questions. Reporters, business partners, people far less careful than the two of us." Victor's expression remained steady, though something firm settled behind his eyes. "I'm certain," he said. "Whatever attention follows, I'll manage it. She's already proven tonight that she can withstand far more than most people ever have to. I won't let that attention become another burden she has to carry alone." Marcus nodded, offering nothing further, though the respect in his expression suggested he understood exactly how significant a shift this represented for a man who had spent years keeping every part of his personal life carefully separated from anything that could be used against him. Victor made his way back toward the break room, finding Daniela finally composed enough to gather her bag, Grace hovering protectively nearby. "I need to tell you something," Victor said finally, as she prepared to leave for the night. "What happened tonight wasn't only about protecting you from a false accusation. It was the final piece I needed to end things with Isabella completely, publicly, without any remaining excuse to delay it." "So it's over," Daniela said quietly. "Your engagement." "It's over," Victor confirmed. "It should have ended weeks ago." Tonight simply made certain there was no version of events left where anyone could argue otherwise. Daniela studied him carefully, searching his expression for any sign of uncertainty, finding none. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Victor said, "I intend to finish what I started the night I first asked for your name. Properly, this time, without hidden investigations or quiet interventions, if you're willing to let me." Daniela didn't answer immediately. The weight of everything that had happened, the accusations, the rescue, the sudden collapse of Isabella's carefully constructed lies, still settling around her. But for the first time since Isabella had humiliated her weeks earlier, she felt something steady beneath the exhaustion, a quiet certainty that whatever came next, she wouldn't be facing it entirely alone. "Ask me again tomorrow," she said finally, a small, tired smile breaking through despite everything. "Tonight, I just want to go home." Victor nodded, respecting the boundary without hesitation. "Tomorrow then," he said. "I'll hold you to that." He walked her to her bus stop personally that night, waiting until she was safely aboard, before finally allowing himself to exhale the tension he had carried since the moment Mr. Harlow's frantic call reached him hours earlier. Whatever remained ahead, confronting Gerald Vance publicly, dismantling whatever retaliation Isabella's family might still attempt, he felt more certain than ever that he was finally choosing the right side of his own complicated, dangerous world, even if it meant walking directly into difficulty in order to protect it. The private dining room at the top of the Halston Tower had never been this crowded or this tense. Isabella had insisted on hosting one final engagement dinner, a public gathering meant to reaffirm the wedding plans in front of investors, business partners, and members of both families. A last desperate attempt orchestrated by Gerald Vance to make any withdrawal from the arrangement appear socially and financially catastrophic. Daniela stood near the entrance of the building, her hands cold despite the warmth of the evening, wearing a simple dark dress Grace had insisted on lending her for the occasion. She had never imagined herself walking into a room like this, filled with powerful people who would judge her on sight before she ever said a single word. But Victor had asked her to be there, not hidden away, not waiting anxiously at home for news, but present, standing beside him when everything finally came undone. "You don't have to do this," Grace had told her earlier that evening, adjusting the small clasp on Daniela's dress with careful hands. "No one would blame you for staying out of it." "I know," Daniela had said, meeting her own reflection in the mirror with a steadiness that surprised her. "But I've spent my whole life being talked about by people who never bothered to actually know me. I'm done disappearing quietly, just because it's easier." Now, standing at the entrance of the grand dining room, watching Isabella move gracefully among her guests, as though nothing at all had changed, Daniela felt her resolve solidify further. She had survived worse than a room full of unfamiliar faces. She could survive this too. Victor found her near the entrance, his expression softening briefly at the sight of her, before returning to the composed, controlled mask he needed for what was about to unfold. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly. "Are you?" Daniela countered. "I've been ready for weeks," Victor said. "I was only waiting for the right moment to make certain it couldn't be undone." They entered together, and the room noticed immediately, conversations quieting into a low murmur, as guests took in the sight of Victor Reyes, arriving not with his fiancée, but with an unfamiliar young woman at his side. Isabella's smile flickered the moment she spotted them, though she recovered quickly, gliding toward them with practiced grace. "Victor," she said smoothly, though her eyes flicked toward Daniela with unmistakable venom. "I didn't realize you'd be bringing a guest." "I thought it was important she be here," Victor said calmly, "for what I'm about to say." Gerald Vance appeared beside his daughter moments later, his expression carrying the same practiced charm that had built his empire, though something sharper flickered beneath it as he studied Victor carefully. "Victor, my boy, glad you could make it. Shall we get started? I believe several of our guests are eager to hear confirmation of the merger timeline." "They'll hear confirmation tonight," Victor said, raising his voice slightly, enough to draw the attention of the surrounding guests without shouting. "Just not the confirmation you're expecting." A ripple of confused murmurs spread through the room as Victor stepped forward, positioning himself where every guest could see and hear him clearly. Isabella's composed expression cracked slightly, panic flashing behind her eyes as she realized what was about to happen. "Victor, this isn't the time," she said quickly, reaching for his arm. He stepped back smoothly, avoiding her touch. "This is exactly the time," he said. "Everyone here has been invited under the assumption that this evening confirms a merger built on partnership and trust. I think everyone deserves to know the truth before any further agreements are signed." Gerald's face hardened, though he maintained his composure for the sake of the watching crowd. "Whatever grievance you think you have, Victor, this is neither the place nor the moment." "On the contrary," Victor said, "I think it's exactly the place. For 9 months, funds have been quietly siphoned from my organization's accounts through structures connected directly to Vance Shipping, hidden behind an engagement designed specifically to grant insider access neither of us discussed openly beforehand." Gasps rippled through the crowd, murmurs rising into audible confusion as guests exchanged uneasy glances. Isabella's face had gone pale, her earlier composure entirely abandoned as she stared at Victor with a mixture of fury and fear. "That's a lie," Gerald said sharply, though his voice wavered slightly under the weight of dozens of watching eyes. "A fabrication meant to destroy this family's reputation." "It's documented," Victor said calmly, nodding toward Marcus, who stepped forward and began distributing carefully prepared folders to key individuals throughout the room: business partners, investors, journalists who had been quietly invited, specifically for this moment. Every transfer, every falsified signature, all of it, verified independently, ready for anyone who wishes to examine it themselves. The room descended into chaos, hushed at first, then rising into open conversation as guests began flipping through the documentation, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock as the extent of the deception became clear. Gerald Vance stood frozen, his empire's carefully protected reputation unraveling in real time in front of the very people whose trust he had spent decades cultivating. Isabella turned to Victor, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "You've destroyed everything," she hissed. "My family, our reputation, everything we built." "You destroyed it," Victor said, his voice quiet but unmistakably firm. "The moment you decided honesty was less useful than manipulation, I simply made certain the consequences finally caught up to the choice." Isabella's eyes moved past him toward Daniela, who stood quietly at his side, watching the unraveling scene with steady composure, despite the intensity surrounding her. "And her," Isabella spat. "Is this what all of this was really about? Throwing away everything we built for some waitress who can't even afford a dress that isn't borrowed?" The room went utterly silent, every eye shifting toward Daniela, waiting to see how she would respond to the cruelty aimed so directly at her, in front of a room full of strangers. Daniela stepped forward calmly, her voice steady despite the weight of every gaze upon her. "I've been called worse things than that tonight," she said. "Illiterate, stupid, unworthy of being in rooms like this. None of it was ever true, and neither is this. I'm not the reason your engagement fell apart, Isabella. Your own choices did that, long before I ever refilled a water glass at your table." A few quiet murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd, some guests nodding slightly, clearly impressed by the composed dignity in Daniela's response, despite the public humiliation aimed her way. Isabella opened her mouth to respond, but Gerald placed a firm hand on her shoulder, his own expression finally cracking under the weight of dozens of documented transfers now circulating openly through the room. "Isabella, enough," he said quietly. "We need to leave. Now." Without another word, father and daughter turned and made their way swiftly toward the exit, the murmuring crowd parting to let them through, no one bothering to offer the polite farewells that would have accompanied their arrival only an hour earlier. The silence that followed their departure felt heavier than any words could have been, the entire room absorbing the magnitude of what had just unfolded in front of them. Victor turned to the remaining guests, his voice calm and measured despite everything that had just occurred. "I apologize for the disruption to your evening," he said, "but I believe everyone here deserved the truth before any further business was conducted under false pretenses. Please, enjoy the rest of the evening. The kitchen has prepared more than enough for everyone." One of the investors, an older woman named Charlotte Whitfield, who had known Victor's late father years earlier, approached Daniela quietly while the room continued to settle. "That took real courage," she said, studying Daniela with genuine curiosity. "Most people in this room would have shrunk under the weight of what Isabella said to you. You didn't." "I've had a lot of practice not shrinking," Daniela said honestly. "It doesn't get easier. You just get better at standing still while it happens." Charlotte smiled, something knowing in her expression. "I've watched a great many people try to earn Victor Reyes's trust over the years, through flattery, through favors, through careful positioning. I don't think I've ever seen him look at any of them the way he looked at you tonight." Daniela didn't quite know how to respond to that, so she simply offered a small, grateful nod, watching as Charlotte moved on to rejoin the other guests, the unexpected kindness settling warmly in her chest. Slowly, cautiously, conversation began to resume throughout the room, guests processing what they had witnessed while trying to return to some semblance of normalcy. Marcus moved quietly among the business partners and investors, answering practical questions about the transition, ensuring the organization's reputation remained intact despite the dramatic revelation. Victor finally turned to Daniela, who stood watching the room slowly settle, her hands no longer trembling, her expression calm despite everything she had just endured. "You didn't have to defend yourself like that," Victor said quietly. "I would have handled her." "I know," Daniela said, "but I've spent my whole life letting other people's cruelty define how small I was allowed to feel. I wasn't going to let this moment be any different, especially not standing right here in front of everyone." Victor studied her for a long moment, something warm and unmistakably sincere settling behind his usually guarded expression. "I told you once that you never lie," he said. "Tonight, in front of everyone who matters in my professional life, you proved it again, without hesitation, even when it would have been easier to stay quiet." "I'm not very good at staying quiet," Daniela admitted, a small, tired smile finally breaking through the tension of the evening, "even when it might be smarter." "I wouldn't want you any different," Victor said. He took her hand gently, the gesture simple but deliberate, a quiet acknowledgement in front of the entire room that whatever had unfolded that evening, the collapse of a calculated betrayal, the public unraveling of a family built on deception, none of it compared to the certainty he now felt standing beside her. "I know this isn't the easiest world to step into," Victor said quietly, just for her to hear. "I know it comes with attention neither of us asked for, and complications you never signed up for. But I'd like the chance to build something honest with you, Daniela, without hidden investigations or careful distances between us. If you're willing." Daniela looked around the room slowly, at the guests who had witnessed her humiliation weeks earlier, now watching her with something closer to respect, at Marcus standing quietly nearby, at the empty space where Isabella and her father had stood only minutes before, their carefully built reputation shattered beyond repair. "I spent so long thinking people like me weren't allowed to want more," she said softly, "that surviving was supposed to be enough. But standing here tonight, I don't think I want to go back to just surviving." "Then don't," Victor said simply. She smiled then, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached her eyes fully for the first time since the humiliation that had started everything weeks earlier. "Ask me properly," she said, "not in the middle of chaos, somewhere quiet, when none of this is watching us." "Tomorrow," Victor said, echoing the promise she had once given him, "I'll hold myself to it, this time." Across the room, Grace watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction, raising a glass slightly toward her friend, before turning back to the conversation surrounding her. The restaurant staff who had witnessed months of quiet cruelty toward Daniela now watched a very different scene unfold, one where the woman once called illiterate and unworthy stood confidently beside one of the most powerful men in the city, not because she had changed who she was to earn that place, but because she had simply refused to let anyone convince her she didn't already belong there. The room slowly returned to its rhythm, conversation, and quiet laughter filling the space where shock and cruelty had stood only minutes earlier. Daniela stood beside Victor, steady and unshaken, watching the city lights glittering beyond the tall windows, thinking of every difficult year that had brought her to this exact moment, every insult she had swallowed quietly, every late night spent studying under a single lamp, every sacrifice made for a brother who deserved every chance she could give him. None of it had been wasted. None of it had been for nothing. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Daniela allowed herself to simply exist in a good moment, without bracing for the next difficulty waiting to knock her down. Whatever complicated future lay ahead, whatever challenges came with stepping fully into a life so different from the one she had always known, she faced it now not as someone small and overlooked, but as someone who had proven, in front of an entire room of powerful strangers, exactly what she had known about herself all along. She had never needed anyone's permission to be worthy of respect. Tonight, everyone in that room had simply, finally, caught up to the truth. Later that night, once the last of the guests had gone, and the grand dining room had emptied into quiet stillness, Victor walked Daniela down to the car waiting outside, the city humming softly around them in the cool evening air. "Your brother will want to hear about all of this," Victor said, opening the car door for her. "Every detail, probably, if I know anything about 16-year-old boys." Daniela laughed softly, the sound easy and unguarded, in a way it hadn't been in weeks. "He's going to ask if you have any friends who need help with their homework, in exchange for advice on how to handle bullies," she said. "He's very practical that way." "I'll take it under consideration," Victor said, a small, genuine smile breaking through his usually composed expression. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the tension of the evening slowly draining away with each passing mile, replaced by something calmer, steadier, the quiet beginning of a future neither of them had expected to find in a spilled glass of water, and a cruel remark meant to make someone feel small. When they arrived at her apartment building, Victor walked her to the door as he had once before, though everything about the moment felt different now, lighter somehow, unburdened by the secrets and careful distances that had defined their earlier conversations. "Thank you," Daniela said, standing in the soft glow of the entryway light. "For tonight? For all of it, really, even the parts that terrified me. Thank you," Victor said, "for never once being anyone other than exactly who you are, even when the entire room expected you to be smaller." She smiled, stepping inside, pausing briefly at the door. "Tomorrow," she reminded him. "Tomorrow," he confirmed. He watched until she was safely inside, before finally turning back toward his car, the city stretching wide and glittering around him, feeling, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he had finally chosen the right path, not the one his world expected of him, but the one that felt honest, steady, and entirely his own. And somewhere above him, in a small apartment where a tired brother waited eagerly for every detail of the evening, Daniela Cruz stood by her window for a long moment, looking out at the same city lights, no longer feeling small, no longer feeling overlooked, finally standing exactly as tall as she had always deserved to stand.